Welcome back to another episode of Beyond the Play. I'm Keegan Brown. Joining us once again is Professor Doug Glanville, a former professional baseball player as well as distinguished journalist and commentator, who currently serves as a professor for the University of Connecticut's Sport Management Program. Professor Glanville, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great, Keegan. Always a pleasure to be here.
Excellent, excellent. So today we have a special guest on the program. Micah Heumann is the director of the ACES program, as well as the Major Experience, a campus-wide collaboration involving students and professionals for the University of Connecticut. He currently serves as an academic advisor to students. Micah, you also have a transgender son who has been an activist for transgender youth from a young age. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Perfect. Well, let's jump right in. So on March 17th, University of Pennsylvania swimmer Lia Thomas became the first openly transgender athlete to win America's top trophy in collegiate sports. She set a program record with her 500-yard freestyle time of 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Amid her victory, though, a national debate was sparked regarding the rights of trans women in sports. Thomas quickly became a pariah for the American right, with many questioning her right to compete. This includes politicians, transphobic activists, and even her competitors. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis called Thomas's victory fraudulent and even signed a proclamation declaring the runner-up Emma Weyant the rightful winner. In an interview with Sports Illustrated, Thomas stated, "I'm a woman, so I belong on the women's team. Trans people deserve that same respect that every other athlete gets." Before Thomas, another high-profile case was with Caster Semenya, an Olympic champion runner who was once banned from competition because the International Association of Athletics Federations deemed she had high testosterone levels that made it unfair for her to compete in women's events, despite being a cisgender woman. So, Professor Glanville, I'll start with you. What is your reaction to the controversy surrounding Thomas and other trans athletes? And do you notice any parallels or callbacks to Black athletes fighting for their right to compete during the Jim Crow era?
Well, Keegan, it's, I say that when I think about my class and we talk about different moments in time in athletics and sort of how they intersect with society, these are direct cases. And so much of it is about education. Whenever you have something different, and especially on the competitive landscape where you have lines of saying winner, loser, or times and comparative, you create this relativity, then it raises all kinds of questions. And so I've seen athletics serve us as a aspirational way forward at its best when you think about the fact that teammates coming together, and when you're in these settings of a clubhouse or a locker room, you gain a different kind of understanding through that intimacy, because you start to focus on, well, all right, how do we come together as a team? And you start to understand the work ethic of your teammates, and it starts to strip away some of these, identity boxes and labels that we can throw on people that take us away from sort of the field of play. And I also look at the fact that you have rules that you're trying to uphold, and these rules are supposed to be equitably distributed. And whenever you have competition where new identities that are unfamiliar historically or have been put in different boxes historically, now when you're getting in the competitive landscape and you have someone like Lia Thomas who wins and has success, you start to create these bifurcated worlds. And I think, to me, what can glue you together in understanding is all of us in search of this common humanity, and understanding that her journey and where she's come from has led us to be open to understanding certain things that we did not before. And that's the opportunity. That's the opportunity of just becoming more educated. So, and I went to University of Pennsylvania. So with Lia Thomas being at Penn, I started to understand and pay a lot more attention and get, quite frankly, educated more about what it means. And there's so much misinformation out there that we need to kind of clear up as sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. And, this conversation certainly isn't new in any respect. Trans athletes have been fighting for their right to compete long before Thomas. And in fact, even here in Connecticut, a federal lawsuit was filed against the Connecticut Interscholastic Athletic Conference, the CIAC conference, alleging that allowing athletes with male anatomy to compete has deprived cisgender athletes of track titles and scholarship opportunities. And while many states have barred trans women from legally competing in women's high school and collegiate sports, there isn't much pushback when it comes to trans men competing in men's leagues. So, Mike, I'd like to bring you in on this. Why is there so much uproar over trans women competing in women's leagues, but seemingly no contention when it comes to trans men competing in men's leagues?
Yeah, by no means can I talk about all the reasons why, but the obvious reasons is gender, right? That we see as men being superior to women overall in our society. We live in a sexist society, in my opinion, still today. And so men are superior, and therefore we don't worry about someone that we think is a woman coming to compete with men because what's the concern, right? They're not going to go compete at the same level, so they won't even make the team, or if they do, they'll lose. And it just goes back to that sexism. We see the same thing with when we're talking about trans rights in general with the bathroom bills that are being going on. I don't mean to go too far off subject, but we see the same thing. The argument is it's not about someone going into the men's restroom. It's about someone going into the women's restroom, right? To assault a little girl, right? And that it's always going after, because I think that's where the fear comes from, right? We can stoke the fears easier with this. That when we say a man is going to go compete with women, well, that's not accurate. It's not a man going to compete with women. It's a woman going to compete with a woman. And if you also look at the regulations around this, right? So if you're getting to the college level, right, the regulations around being able to compete as a trans athlete, it's not that I can just say today, I'm a woman and I'm going to go compete with the women's teams. It doesn't work that way. Right, you have to go through steps, and you have to be monitored, and you have to have your blood taken, right? You have to have your testosterone at a certain level. All these things have to be done and monitored, and you're basically putting yourself as I hate to say, a guinea pig in some ways, because you have to admit, right? You have to have a psychological evaluation admitting this, that you have gender dysphoria, which in itself can be harmful to say that there's something wrong. You're saying there's something wrong with me. Right. And I think that's problematic in itself. It's just the same thing when we were talking about being gay, right? It used to be in the DSM as a psychological issue, right? That you had to claim that you were something wrong with you and that's why you're gay. Well, we took that out. We know that's not the issue. I think we're going to see the same progress with people that have gender, are transgender or gender nonconforming. But as we build up to this, they have to go through these steps. And the idea that they don't is this misconception. That's how a lot of politics played out, right? Is that, oh, it's just, I can say I get to go in the women's shower. I get to say I get to go in the women's bathroom. And it just doesn't work that way. And on a bigger piece too, we hear about it when the trans athlete wins, right? But there's trans women competing all over this country and they're losing because it's all about great athletes competing at their best. And yes, does it mean sometimes an athlete that identifies as transgender as a female will win sometimes? Well, yes, of course, because they're working their butts off to be the best they can. And it's just that one, those one or two stories you hear about that just blow up and say, see, all scholarships are going to be gone for cisgender women. But it's not the case. We're not seeing this, right? So trans women have been competing in several states for years now, and we're not seeing this domino effect of they're taking everything. They're not winning every competition they're in. They're not taking every scholarship. So let's also base this in reality and let's not, fall susceptible to the hype that's going on out there.
That's a good point. And, this conversation is becoming more and more common in today's world, the recognition of gender as a spectrum rather than a strict binary, and the growing education about trans people to combat transphobia, which in itself is rooted in general misconceptions of trans folk. Professor Glanville, in our pre-filming meeting, you mentioned that your Little League coach transitioned. A colleague of yours over at ESPN, Christina Carl, is trans. One connection you brought up that I thought was, particularly noteworthy was your daughter made a sort of friendship bracelet for a non-binary classmate so that their friends could identify what pronouns to use for them. Talk to me about these personal connections and how that has shaped your worldview when it comes to trans folk, particularly in sport.
Well, Keegan, I think these type of experiences are often difference makers. It's sort of, whether it's the empathy and understanding that you gain by just having close proximity and experiences that open up your mind. And especially when young people come along, I'm a parent and I'm learning from my kids. And when you have your mind open to that, you all of a sudden can see things differently. And so I'm thankful for that, because I think it's taken me to places that, my upbringing, which was, much more rooted in this sort of binary world, would have received differently had I not sort of grown and evolved and started to gain more understanding. And I think, I mentioned with Lia Thomas, being a Penn athlete myself, understanding that there's such a challenge in being this kind of pioneer in some ways. And as Micah said, when you win, that's when, all this stuff changes, even though all the other data seems to get thrown out. They start to look at this as the only scenario. And the challenge, and when you're in this position, is policy starts to fold around you, and you want it to be smart. You want the policy to be based in humanity and understanding and sort of an inclusive sense of how we come together, instead of ostracizing or drawing lines in the sand, all these things that can happen, or politicizing in a way that's really negative. And so Leah Thomas challenge, and many of these athletes have this challenge of policy, chasing them, right? You mentioned Caster Semenya, and they even acknowledged when they made policy around her to say, oh, well, this is probably unfair to you, but we're trying to set something for a larger group. I mean, they recognize that. And just like Lia Thomas with HRT, hormone replacement therapy, they changed in February 1st, they changed that to 36 months, whereas athletes now have to be on these longer protracted courses. So when you're in it, a lot of times you can see sometimes the direct unfairness, because like, wait a minute, was that policy for just me all of a sudden because I won? Or is this actually good policy, right? So I think for me, it's important and understand, like we talked about in class, about social norms and all the other ways, legally, politically. There's a lot of catch up that has to happen in education. And to Micah's point, you think of any class of identity or being Black, as you mentioned, there's so many things that take so much time, and you're gaining education, that you're going to go through these really difficult periods that you're trying to catch up. A lot of people are trying to catch, and some will not want to. Okay, you have to recognize that some will not want to. They just said, there's going to be. So, I feel like we're in kind of a watershed moment, and we will continue. And what I appreciate about athletics is, although you get into these bottom line worlds of winning and losing, or medals and not medals, the athletes that start to compete will see that differently, because you have a teammate. And Leah Thomas had all these teammates at Penn swimming, and yeah, some were definitely not necessarily supportive or felt comfortable with all these things. But then there's also a community that was, and that's important to recognize, that could be part of how you move forward. Gaining that knowledge and sharing it.
Absolutely. And Mike, as we mentioned at the top of the show, you have a transgender son who has taken it upon himself to become an activist for transgender youth. How has his activism shaped your views on trans rights?
Yeah, well, I mean, completely. I'll be honest, I consider myself someone that tried to be aware of different privileges I had and different existences of other people. And when he came out at 7 and told us who he was, his authentic self, I found myself having to do a lot of research and learn, right? And through that process, I mean, I've grown a lot into understanding my privileges about being able just to go into the bathroom in my whole life and not be concerned that I was going to be ostracized, or someone to look in to make sure I have the right genitalia to be in the bathroom I'm in. And then for him to go on and want to make sure that the future youth that come out and identify as trans is better for them. I mean, I'm humbled by him. I wasn't able to do that at his age, right? I was about myself. I was a typical teenager, me, right? And I didn't care about anyone else unless it was going to impact me. And so his ability to step outside of himself and try to make things better for others, while still understanding his privilege, right? So I want to be clear, he's still a white trans person, right? Which, and I'm not saying because of Black people are against trans, I'm just saying, if you're looking at intersectionality and how much harder it is to be a Black individual in this country, right? A Black woman in this country, a Black trans woman in this country, right? You kind of go down this list. He needs to be aware of his privileges, which we make sure too, and he is aware of that. So as much as I'm proud of him and the work he does, he still sits in a place of privilege that he presents as a white man. And he passes as a white cisgender man. And there's a lot of privilege with that and what his voice is allowed to do versus someone else with different skin tone or different gender identity. So I say all that to say I'm very proud of him. I'm very humbled. I've learned a lot from him and the group that he's a part of, which is the Gender Cool organization, gendercool.org, which is all about youth and it's all about transforming the conversation, right? It's not, what they are, it's who they are, right? These are kids. And what I like to tell people is, yes, I have two kids, one cisgender, one identifies transgender, but every day it's not like we have a transgender dinner. He doesn't do transgender homework, right? He does homework. We have dinner. It's not this constant thing in our lives. And when it comes up more, it's these laws that are pushing and keeping him from living his authentic self, just trying to exist in the world. And so it's I don't know. I can't tell you. I mean, I'm so proud of him. I'm proud of both my kids because my younger one also defends and has become an advocate in his own way, shape, and form. Right, not on the bigger national spectrum, not nationally, but still with his friends group and who he represents and how he represents himself to be inclusive. And listen, at the end of the day, I just want my kids to be kind to other people, hard workers. Right. I mean, it really breaks down to that. And I'm not going to care about how they identify, how they want to present themselves to the world, because that's your one piece of ownership you get, right? Is how you present yourself. And I just think about how so much, especially as a kid, is taken away from you at times, right? How little authority you have over your environment and yourself. And for the youth out there to dress the way they want to, or to identify the way they want to, this is them taking ownership of their bodies. And I think that's something that should be celebrated because it's not about impacting anyone else. It's about self-ownership and being yourself. And I think we need to be celebrating that. And I realize there's fear in that. But I think when we step back, and there's a lot of beauty in it too, to see youth just to be themselves and who they want to be and how they want to express themselves. So yeah, I don't mean to go long-winded on that too, but in short, I've learned a lot and humbled a lot. And Nike has been a great sponsor with the Gender Cool Champions. They have commercials out right now on multiple networks, including Fox News, talking about trans youth and athletes, right? And what they're doing with coaches in the commercial and athletes in the commercial. So we see it shifting, right? Nationally, you see corporations starting to understand and want to take some social responsibility that we haven't seen historically in the past, especially if we're looking for back in segregation and things like that, and Black athletes coming in. We didn't see that same corporation that I can recall. But it's nice to see it, but now we see that backlash. So now we see the states coming up and banning specifically female trans athletes competing. We see bathroom bills coming out that and again, you look at some of these things, and for the bathroom bills, I'll go to that real quick. I don't mean to get too far off athletics, but it involves the trans athletes. How do you tell if someone is a male or female? And their idea is that you check their genitalia, but who wants their genitalia checked every time you go to the bathroom? Talk about a police state, right? And because the reality is, we talk about this, is we are all on a spectrum. We all look differently. There's women, cisgender women with short haircuts that have much more muscle than I have, right? And there's cisgender men that have long hair and have very feminine faces, if we're going to use these terms, right? That will get called out in bathrooms. And we've seen that actually happen. I can give an example too. My younger son, who used to have longer hair, he was a drummer and had longer hair. It's shorter now, but he was always misgendered as a girl. So he was going into the boys' bathroom, which was the appropriate bathroom for him to go into. Yet according to these new policies in some states, he would need to be checked. But how is he going to be checked other than checking his genitalia? I'm not letting anyone check my child's genitalia like that unless you're a doctor, right? or I'm in the room with them. And so how do you police that then? How are these things being held? And again, we know the policies around the athletes, and they keeps getting tighter, right? Again, we know that they have restrictions about trans athletes competing in it. And so then we just see it just kind of ballooning out. And to me, it's midterm elections. We see it just coming out for people to get votes. And it's gross that this is what it's taking our country to get votes. But again, we see the same thing with racism and race in this country as well, too. It's just, it constantly repeats itself as to the newest current issue that people want to take on. And racism is a bad thing now, which is good that it is, but transphobia is not, right? It's seen as still as a good thing, which that's the problem we're in right now.
Absolutely. And to your point, Caster Semenya, as we mentioned before, she had high testosterone levels, but she was completely a cisgender woman. She's a Black woman. And she was unable to compete in women's leagues because of that. So it's important to recognize that gender is a spectrum and not the binary that we've grown so accustomed to thinking and believing. And, I think the next logical step is, how can we move forward? With sports, as we talked about, there's not only a barrier in stigma, but there's also a competition barrier for trans athletes. Professor Glanville, what steps should be taken so that transgender athletes can compete in sports while fair competition can still be maintained?
I think it's not very different than many other pioneering moments and pioneering times of what athletes have done to open up the world to focus on the competition. Leah Thomas and others are athletes. They want to compete. And when you read about or listen to Lia Thomas speak, she talks about, I just want to swim, she says that quite often. And it's sort of getting to that core of what we're trying to experience as athletes and competitors, and celebrate the values of sport that are so much more than the trophy. It's so much more valuable. I mean, I'm having kids and trying to be in these youth leagues, and you see that there's a whole machinery now of, travel clubs and all these things, right? And trying to instill certain passions, but also there's a true bottom line in the business side of it. And you want to make sure that you're still focusing on the core benefits of sport as well, which are, that transcend all these boxes, so to speak, right? And really recognize that the empathy comes from understanding what it lives in the box, and maybe at some point we get to the point where the box disappears, because that's ideal. That's ideal for all of us to focus and be able to hone in on what is really great about sport. So I like to see policy start to mature and grow with that, instead of governing by fear, because we have a lot of history to tap on where that always takes us, dividing people and, basing things on nothing that doesn't have evidence behind it. And maybe that gets you votes, but it creates such a toxic environment. And I'd like to see sports lead more. And just like taking the time, even preparing for this show, getting more educated and understanding and talking to people and taking away the boogeyman factor, all that to me would be a great way where sports can lead. And in some ways, there are athletes in sports that are, and I think we focus on those elements because we could all benefit.
And for you, Micah, maybe sort of outside the sports world, what action steps can people take to create a more welcome and inclusive world for trans people?
Yeah, I think there's several ways. I'm not going to cover them all, but I think watching our language, and even Keegan, even looking how you just did it, and it wasn't intentional, I know, but they were completely cisgender, right? And that completely, almost completely woman. Well, they're all women. These all identify as women. The trans women are cis women. They're all women. So we need to watch our language, because language impacts. Again, we need to know the facts. We need to get to know what the reality is, and that's one of the reasons I love working on a college campus, because I think the epitome of what education teaches is to be critical thinkers, not to criticize, but to be critical thinkers, meaning we're looking at things critically. We're saying, okay, this is the information I received. Now let me look at more information and let me get a full picture of it. And let me have a better understanding before I formulate my own thoughts and opinions. And I think when people get to know, so again, you come see my family, we're just a family that's just trying to love each other, be good people, and work hard in this world. That's it. Not trying for anything other than that in our lives. And I think when people understand and see that, either meet someone that identifies as transgender or meet someone that, is part of a family that's transgender, now they get to see, well, my experience with someone that identifies trans is different than that negative thing I hear on the news, right? So they get to start having different experiences. We know it's so true, right? When you have interactions with other people, again, the problem when we're so segregated in this country, and we still are, right? We look at race and everything else, is that we don't get to know people. And therefore those fears, because again, if we go to our reptilian brain and back, when we were, in our tribes, right, there is protectiveness, right? We want to protect our tribes. That's where the athletics comes in, right? You want to be a part of that team. You want to be a part of something. And so, but if we can have our brains get beyond that initial fear and realize when I get to know someone, it's a different experience than what I see on the news, right? And again, we can see this with so many different things with our biases that come out in the news, right? So we can see a Black person that's arrested for the same thing a white person is. And what does the media put out in that article? It's that the Black person was a thug, the white person was a good boy that's just in the wrong place, wrong time, right? Or we look at even going back to, I'm watching the about the Lakers right now and how the media, portrayed Larry Bird versus Magic Johnson, right? Irvin Johnson, where Irvin just had natural talents. Larry Bird had to work hard, right? So if you're a Black person, right, it was given to him, right? But the white person had to work hard. He's a hard worker. So these constant narratives keep getting put on us with all groups of people. And if we can start to look at things critically, analyze this information coming into us critically and say, okay, let me read that again. What did that say? And let me compare and contrast. When we start analyzing that, we start realizing that these words are impacting our then judgments and how we're interacting with other human beings in the world. And then when we go in and actually meet someone, get to know someone, right? So if I get to know Doug, right, then my experiences with a Black man and what I'm seeing in the media are different because I say, well, wait, no, because my experience with a Black man is that I'm not threatened. I'm not being hurt, right? And even if that's what the media is telling me I should be afraid of. Same thing with, Islamophobia and things like this too. But with transphobia, again, we're seeing this, it's these fears, right? We're going to stoke these that someone's going to come and molest your daughter. And the bathroom bills, what really gets me is that people can buy into this and they think that sexual assault can be prevented with these bathroom bills. Because that's what they're saying. Someone's going to come in, a man like me is going to come into a girl's room and assault a little girl. To think that you putting a rule that I can't go into a women's bathroom is what's going to protect a child from being assaulted. Like that's only way assaults have occurred in the past is in a bathroom. And by you telling me, oh, I can't go in that bathroom. Oh, you're right. You know what? I'm not going to, commit sexual assault right now because I can't go into that bathroom. That's not what's going to stop this, right? It's educating our men in a lot of ways of how to treat women is going to prevent sexual assault. And having talks around all ages, from like early ages, what's going to prevent this. So again, we have these fears of we're afraid of our little girls from being sexually assaulted because that's where these things come from. But then we think about what actually is going to prevent our girls from being assaulted and women being assaulted. And again, it's not just women and girls being assaulted, but I'm just going off of what these commercials and these policies push. And so again, when we look at the actual facts and when we look at what can actually prevent this, we're talking about something very different and has nothing to do with what this conversation is about. So I think it's educating ourselves. It's getting to know people. And it's hard to do in this society. I'm going to be honest. It's hard to do. So I feel for people. We are isolated in some ways, even though we have social media, but that social media is very biased in its own way. So I challenge people to meet that person and introduce yourself to that person that you've never met, that looks differently than you in any way, shape, or form, is an immigrant, is a person that's disabled, right? I mean, the list goes on and on. And when you get to know people, it does change. It changes your perspective and it changes your experiences, which I think is key to all of this.
Absolutely. And, that's a great closing point. Transphobia as a whole is rooted in miseducation and misconceptions. I think the inclusion of trans people more and more in our society will lead to people, educating themselves on these people and recognizing that they just want to be recognized, in the same way as cisgender people are. And transphobia as a whole, in sort of educating people, I think is very important. So that, Micah, thank you so much for joining us. Professor Glanville as well, thank you again for coming onto the show. And on behalf of the crew over at UCTV Sports, we thank you all for tuning in to another episode of Beyond the Play.
Thank you.
Thanks, Keegan.